Brought to a close with this meeting, and I'd like to invite Dr. Ahluwalia, the Chairperson of ICRIER, to open the proceedings for us.
Thank you. Thank you, and a very good morning to all of you. I must begin by thanking Meenu Tewari for having really driven this project and moving ICRIER in an area which is going to be increasingly important. And I thank the Rockefeller Foundation, and Amit Prothi is sitting here, for their support, and in fact, for their role in pushing us into this area. You know, we have, as you know, ICRIER has been focusing on competitiveness and economic growth and all of that for a long time. About 7-8 years ago, we had decided that we must bring urbanization and climate change to the center of our work. Climate change is not something that we should think of only as an adjunct to our mainstream work, but that it must be integrated in our way of thinking. I can't say that we have fully succeeded, nor has the country, nor has the world, in really integrating climate change into the way we approach development, urbanization, and growth, but we are moving in that direction, slower than I would like, slower than all of us would like. But for example, when we sent out the invitations to people to come and participate with us in this process of thinking, we did not limit it only to the sustainable growth wallas. We tried to reach out to others. You know, just as we have made this journey slowly but steadily, our effort today is that we have to get more and more people into, this journey. Now, you know, there was a time when I see many younger faces here, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to just show to talk about the journey to our younger people so you realize where we are coming from. There was a time when in India we were saying that even growth is not that important. So we grew at 3.5% per year for 3-4 decades after independence, and that we had to focus on removing poverty. And we felt that we could do that without rapid growth. Then beginning with the 80s, the mood changed, and there was some recognition that, yes, growth and poverty have some connection, although it's not automatic. Growth is a necessary condition for poverty removal, but not sufficient. So we began to focus on growth, and poverty alleviation always remained, you know, as the principal goal. Then we realized that growth cannot be sustained unless we really address the challenges of structural transformation of the economy as we grow, which means as we move from agriculture to industry and services, and we have urbanization as an associated process with growth, we needed to fix our cities, and urbanization brought with it many challenges. So I think it was at that stage that ICRIER decided that we won't just talk of growth, but let's see the role of cities in engineering growth. And this was because we had now, by 2005, we had already had about 25 years of faster growth. And we were actually one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And yet, the cities that were participating in this growth process were fraying at the edges. So we needed to fix these cities. And we felt that the whole climate change dialogue, the whole environment dialogue had somehow been seen as something that we did at international conferences. And this agenda was being imposed on us by the other world, who had actually spoiled the planet, and now they wanted us to do it a different way. And naturally, it acquired a political kind of character, and we will always say that, yes, we are willing to address these changes, but who will pay for it? And it got into that rut, until we suddenly woke up and realized that there was a very direct public health challenge that, was facing us. And it was not, when you talk about climate change and environment, it seems like, distant thing. But when you begin to see new viruses coming up and, health challenges, water contamination, and with awareness and with greater information, you feel that you do not need to do this to please somebody else. You need it for your own survival. So it was at that stage, I got inducted into this process completely accidentally when I was made in charge of a high-powered expert committee on infrastructure and public service delivery. And I must confess, as a mainstream economist, what we saw when we collected the evidence on water, sanitation, waste management, all these issues, flooding, drainage in our cities, you felt that the economics was not disconnected with the environment. You just had to bring the two together. And so ICRIER decided that we were going to have the urbanization and climate change as a thrust area amongst our research areas. We were also helped in this process by Lord Nixon, who was very keen that we should get involved in his project on the new climate economy. And I must say, at that stage, when he approached us, my initial reaction was perhaps, he would be happier if he went to TEDI or, some other institutions that focused on climate change. We were just beginning, and I was a bit diffident whether we could take on this task. And he felt that he wanted to pose that challenge to us. He wanted a mainstream economics think tank to worry about new climate economy. So I was dragged into being in the advisory committee of the new climate economy report, and ICRIER prepared parts of that new climate economy report. Meenu also helped us with that. And it was, I thought, the whole learning process, the whole building of capacity at ICRIER, and personally for me, learning about this challenge and all, was something for which I can't thank Nixon enough. And it was around that time that we discovered Professor Meenu Tewari, who was also coming into the same area from her mainstream economic research that she had been doing. And I think it was her idea that she said that, Rockefeller Foundation was interested in the subject, and let us bring a group of young researchers at ICRIER together, and she was willing to lead this team. So, here we have this excellent team from ICRIER that has worked on this. And I volunteered to put myself in the team because I was very interested in the solid waste management. So I said to Meenu that, look, on one condition, that I will do the solid waste management paper. And I found a young partner, Utkarsh Patel. So we also have a paper. So this is the kind of research which many of us had not done before. Most of us are with economics background, but we learned a great deal. And I think that's basically what we are going to be sharing with you. But I mean, having shared the genesis of this project, and having also shared the reluctance in India to admit that there is this problem, I would have to say that today there is wide agreement that climate change has profound impact on all aspects of human life, whether you talk of human settlements or ecological systems or public health. As I said, all of these are deeply affected by what we are witnessing. And the effect of climate change is likely to intensify in the years to come. Also, there is growing recognition, although I think not sufficient recognition, and that is where this project should make a difference, is that all this impact of climate change has economic consequences. So it is not something which you can just turn as an externality. This has to be built into your economic calculations, because the consequences of your economic decision-making will really depend on how far you have actually addressed the challenge posed by climate change. Now, again, this is not new to this audience, that cities today have more than 50% of the world population living in these urban areas. 2/3 of the global output of the world comes from urban areas. Now, India is lagging behind, but fast catching up in this respect. The 2011 census said that 31% of our population is urban. I believe this to be a huge underestimate, as many others do. But there are still those that fight the number and say, no, India lives in its villages. And I'm surprised to come across that resistance even today. But even if we take the 31% figure, we are somewhere around 37% or so of Indian population living. And as I said earlier on, when we experience rapid growth, particularly in the decade of the 2001-2010, there were a handful of cities that really drove this growth. And Bengaluru, Hyderabad, Ahmedabad, Mumbai, Delhi, but these cities are fraying at the edges. And so that is basically the challenge. And we know that climate change disrupts life, property, and resources in urban systems, and it can therefore severely destabilize the fabric of economic life. These impacts are magnified in emerging economies because they are trying to get to faster growth, get through structural transformation, and more people in these economies are moving to live in the deeply congested urban areas. Just to put numbers to these, because percentages never convey the importance of the problem, from 375 million or so in 2011, urban population in India is projected to increase to 600 million by 2031. And by 2030, 70% of all net new jobs really will be created in the urban sector. So, as I said earlier, the economic competitiveness of emerging economies like India is increasingly contingent on the competitiveness of their cities. So how can cities secure their economic competitiveness in the face of escalating climate change? The research that you have in this area mostly focuses on the mitigation of climate change. And that too, it's mostly at the aggregate level. The more disaggregated work on the economic effects of climate change, which is there, again, focuses really on issues of mitigation. There is little work that exists on questions of adaptation to climate change risks at the city level, and even less that links a city's economic competitiveness to climate-related vulnerability. The Rockefeller Foundation has taken a lead in this area, especially with its 100 Resilient Cities program, and the city-level work of ACAN, the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network. They are undertaking pioneering work at the local level, and we have been very fortunate in getting their support for this. ICRIER's focus on economic policy research and competitiveness issues, its new thrust areas on urbanization and climate change, and our experience in fostering collaborative research and facilitating informed discussion amongst policymakers has made this collaboration with the Rockefeller Foundation especially productive. And it's really good to have Amit Prothi of Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities represent the foundation here today. In fact, I was again very fortunate that I was one of the juries for selecting the cities, and that was quite a learning experience as well to see, Now, cities and urban growth centers face three interlinked challenges: how to foster economic growth, how to manage a complex urbanization process, and how to cope with the stressors of climate change. Though the need to adapt is apparent, because of severe resource constraints, poor institutional capacity, and lack of data and evidence, local governments and policymakers are not always able to link and integrate these goals. Adding an economic lens to adaptation effects and understanding mechanisms and institutional arrangements through which the economic effects of adaptation play out would help us think more concretely about these issues. So in the end, I would say that really what you are going to be observing in this half-day workshop is a presentation by the individual researchers in different aspects of what they have studied. And then Meenu Tewari will be presenting the findings that emerge from this. And I think more than anything else, what really comes out of her presentation, as you would see, is how many new research areas are opened, so that we really need to have more research, more collaborative research, and actually even generate data in the process as we do this research, because the honest truth is data is very difficult to come by. And I would therefore urge to Rockefeller Foundation that if you want to take this work further, you should actually bring the urban local governments and think tanks together. I mean, I remember that, in the Chennai Municipal Corporation, for example, because they had Vikram Kapoor, who was a very able person, as who was also part of my committee when we did work on urban infrastructure. We learned a lot from him, and he was able to implement a lot of what we were studying. So if somehow an institutional collaborative arrangement can be brought about, where not only do we do dissemination of these research findings, but we reach out to a new set of cities, induct those urban local governments into this process, I think you will be able to see much greater value for the money that you have spent. Because otherwise what happens is, very often, very good research is done, and then it gets published somewhere and it's kind of left there. But I think here there is so much which is available, as you will see, and we want to benefit from this interaction. It should really reach out to the rest of urban India, and we should make them stakeholders in moving more in this direction. I've probably taken more than what you allotted for me, but thank you very much. And with this, I hand over the proceedings to Professor Meenu Tewari. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahluwalia. They've set the stage very well. And once again, welcome everyone. I will probably be briefer than I would have otherwise been, because Dr. Ahluwalia has made some of the points that I would have liked to talk about. So if I skip some slides, that's intentional. So if you look at the title, it's sort of suggestive. Resiliency urbanism. We don't know what that is. Hopefully, at the end of the discussion today, we will put some, some bones and flesh to that. So let me begin with the project. So what we have here is a fact, and the fact is that, as Dr. Ahluwalia had said, India is on an S-curve of urbanization. It's just starting to ramp up, and over the next few years, there'll be a lot faster transition into urban areas. But this massive urban transition that's going to happen, just given our population, is happening at a very different moment than Latin America or even China urbanized. And that's because of the pressures of a changing climate. So the resources that we have access to, the way we think about energy, the way we think about our systems, the way we think about organizing our spaces, and our urban economy is going to be fundamentally different because of this debate that exists. So here, if we just see that, that yes, it's good for India to urbanize. It will help its poverty goals and other things, and we are set to kind of double up. But you can already see people talking about this ecological debt that is growing, that we are using resources already beyond our means. And that's not all. If you take sector after sector, there are a whole lot of issues, and many of you have done a lot more research to explain the problem. But just taking some of the things like water stress alone, India is already a water-stressed country. It's one of the countries that is going to even see the worsening of its water problem. And so cities are engines of growth, but they're also concentrations of people. And as Dr. Ahluwalia said, the people are organized in sort of risky ways often. So if there's any stress, then the impact on lives, the impact on the economy is massive. And so paying attention to, of course, all populations everywhere at a time of climate change is important, but particularly to the cities where the vulnerable concentrate, and others as well. So, just one fact here, that with regard to water, we have a fifth of the world's population, but access to only 3% of the world's freshwater resources. This need not be a problem. Countries like Israel and others are much worse off than this, but then they have built capacity to deal with it, and we are just starting out. So the point is that, while mitigation is all important, we'll have to adapt. And the point of this research is that the time to adapt is now, and exactly how do we do it? And again, in this room, there are lots of people who've done wonderful work on adaptation in cities. But as we've talked about, those experiences tend to be fragmented. And so what we want to do is bring some more evidence to the table to see whether we can find patterns that cut across them that can push us towards a more sustainable path forward. So with that in mind, we just want to frame the project that we started. So we began with the premise that adaptation is a very variable phenomena. It's spatially very variable. It's playing out differently in different places. The problems are different. The same climate stresses are expressed and experienced very differently in different places. So let's go local. Let's look at what's happening at the local level and what cities are doing about it in different ways. And the main question we wanted to ask is that, as Dr. Ahluwalia said, that our local governments are severely constrained, resource constrained institutionally in terms of capacity. So what would motivate a local government that has lots of deficits to fill to act on something that is not very, very certain and not very, very clear and quite vague sometimes? So what motivates cities to act on climate risks was what we started to ask. And then we wanted to say that, our initial work said that if you make an argument that the bottom line of the city is going to be impacted, that if you don't do something, it's going to cost you later on, they sort of listen to you. They sit up and listen to you. So there was this question that came up that, is adapting to climate risk going to be good for local economies as well? And so what can we say about it? So initially when we started, we had grand ideas of quantifying all kinds of things, and very quickly we realized that's very hard because the data don't exist even when you're working in cities. So we thought, okay, let's deep dive and see what's going on. So we picked 4 cities, and these are the 4 cities. At the end, our focus became Surat mainly because there was a lot going on there, and we brought in the other cities as and when we needed for comparison. But we used mixed methods, case studies, field research, and data analysis to the extent that we could get it. And we picked these 4 cities because for 2 reasons. One, they were secondary cities. And as many consultants like to say, that 90% of urban India is yet to be built, and a lot of the infrastructure and so forth will be in these kinds of cities. So we wanted to see not the retrofitting problem of metros, but these up-and-coming cities. What kinds of decisions are they making? How can they make different decisions? So we wanted to look at rapidly growing secondary cities. And then we wanted to build on something that had already been done. And Tharu and Ehsan and others had done quite a bit of work in these cities. So we thought, let's build on that because data are so difficult to come by. And we also wanted to mine some variation in these cities, which is that they had different industrial structures. So normally we were doing an academic piece of research, we would say, let's do a tightly paired comparison, similar things, different outcomes and so forth. But here we were just learning. This was about discovery more than anything else. So we said, let's mine this variation and look at these different industrial structures that they have, labor intensive. 2 of our cities are labor intensive, Ludhiana and Surat, and of course beyond that as well. And then Pune and Kochi are mixed. They have services as well as other manufacturing, and they have sort of different governance structures. We won't talk too much about it, but just this list here is something we discovered. It's not something we started with. That, Ludhiana is efficient, but it's sort of entrepreneurial, quite laissez-faire. Surat is sort of benign top-down. It's a technocracy, but has a very involved business elite. And Pune has a very competent local government, but a very, very vocal and organized civil society. And Kochi is participatory. So do they do things differently is what we had in mind at the back. And we had this wonderful team here that we pulled together that picked different themes, and we dug into it. This is just basically our framework. Basically, it says that climate stresses of temperature, rising temperatures, and uncertain precipitation, sea level rise where it is happening, will likely impact cities and urban economies through these 4 vantage points, through their industrial structures and the kind of jobs they create and the disruptions in these supply chains that happens, through urban services, and we focused on water and on transportation, and then on livelihoods, where do people live, where do they work, and then capacities, institutional capacities and local governance. There we looked at plans, we looked at budgets, we looked at, what priorities do the budgets indicate, all kinds of things, and then try to understand what impacts might be visible on the ground. So we did all kinds of initial analysis of these budget documents and plans of different kinds. We used data that was already available in, especially in the universities in South Africa. We found some portals, used available models to find these, ranges or bands in which each of our cities would face problems. And as I said, the bottom line was rising temperatures and more rain on fewer days, and uncertain rain was what we found. And then there was, of course, a widening of the disease window because of warming temperatures and in some cases sea level rise. And then we build, the usual things of vulnerability profiles from the data that we had available, and economic mapping, and then realized that doesn't tell us all that much. These things are very helpful, but we had to go to the cities and actually talk to them. So we went to each of the cities and had focus groups with local governments and others. We had interviews, we had sectoral work, and that's what I'm going to share the results with. So what I'll talk about today in my presentation is overall, sort of about 10 findings that we came up with, and then our team will each illustrate in a little more detail some of those findings. So the first question, and these are organized around a set of questions. The first question was that who is likely to act when things are uncertain about climate pressures, and there are all kinds of constraints? Who is likely to act? How are local governments likely? Under what conditions are they likely to act? So the first finding here was that this is not a surprise, but this was something was interesting to see on the ground, that when the perceived risks are diffuse or uncertain or non-specific, that is general, and if those that hold social and political power are not directly impacted, it's very difficult for the local government, even if they're convinced, to really move forward and act. Or at least there is slowness in their acting, and unless problems cross a certain threshold. So, the kinds of things like groundwater depletion, poor solid waste management just sits around. Not much happens unless it translates into disease. The second related finding was something that Amrita Goldar did as a result of her climate work, was that there are all these models that are aggregate, like Dr. Ahluwalia said, that talk about national level projections and international projections, regional projections, but they're hardly downscaled to the city level. So when you go to cities, it's only national stuff that you're talking, and they say, my problem is very different from the problem of Visakhapatnam or some other city. So how does this affect me? Can you do a similar thing and tell me numbers for my city? And there isn't very much of very good downscaling that exists, and so there's a resistance that if I don't know what I'm getting into, it's not so easy to act. And so, some of these things about data and bringing the data down to the local level is, of course, extremely important. So the takeaway is that, can we do something where we can, mandate sort of gathering of data at the local level, just like JNNRUM and these other national programs forced cities to make their CDPs and other plans, and they for the first time gathered data that they didn't usually used to collect. And so similarly, can we do that around climate and the economy and so forth? So there are some policy takeaways. I won't go into each of these. The slides will be on our website, but there are things that we can actually do. City-university relationships and formalizing them are great because you have a great resource. People do their theses, so there's a lot that can be done there. The third finding related to this issue was a very important one for us. It really opened our eyes. And of course, again, many of you know this already, but this was the fact that there are these deep differences in perception of risk when there is a sudden onset event or an extreme event that is sudden onset, and if it is regular, happens all the time, versus slow onset events. In a city after city, we found that was absolutely very, very important in explaining why some cities act and others don't. So gradual onset events, such as, Slow temperature changes, air quality, Delhi's situation. For years it's been there, but now people have started to take notice. Groundwater depletion goes on till till you can't do anything but focus on it. Sea level rise, these are very difficult to act on, as opposed to extreme events like huge precipitation, what happened in Kerala, what happened in Mumbai, what happened in Surat, and especially if there is a disease contagion associated with this kind of extreme event. Gradual events then also lead to kind of costly post-facto adaptation problems. That you have a problem that you know is escalating, but you ignore it for a very long time, and then suddenly it's upon you, and then it's very costly to fix it. So we found that happened in some of our cities as well. So this example of Kerala, some of its low-lying areas are submerging. This has been known for a very long time, but now when the problem has really reached a certain proportion, cities and others have been caught off guard. So that's the difference. The other is about sudden onset events and these extreme events that happen suddenly and are very visible and affect a lot of people. These may lead to climate action. They need not always lead to climate action, but we had a case like Surat where it did happen. But even so, we found that even when it happens and there's an extreme event, if somebody can explain it away and say that was a natural disaster, that not in my control, like Kerala, for example, natural disaster, it happened. Then the response is very disaster management oriented, and it stays that way. 3 months down the road, now people are talking about Sabrimala, other kinds of things. That whole thing about the floods is gone. So it need not always, lead to push us beyond the disaster mentality. So there are these takeaways which I won't spend time on, but we can draw some conclusions from this. So then if in terms of what we saw in the field about who was acting, one of the things that we saw clearly was that when something that you value is impacted seriously, then you act. And especially if this happens to impact people that are powerful in a big way, then you act. And so I'll give you some examples of that. So when the bottom line of the business elite is hugely impacted, not just the regular, okay, we lost something, but massively. You don't get business anymore because your city is known for plague. So people who come to place orders from outside are afraid to come. That's huge. That's a reputational question. So when the bottom line of the business elite is impacted, they will put pressure on the local government to act. Similarly, when a bureaucracy's own self-image of its competence is called into question, not privately, not in the halls of the city government office, but publicly, on the national stage, on the international stage, where who you really are and your self identity is threatened, then the same people who are very mediocre one day can act and change and become quite different pretty soon. So this was the case of Surat. Similarly, when the politically strong vocal groups face concentrated risks, then they act. And then also in cases where there are strong civic groups, like building on the very frail hills of Pune is a huge issue. But there's a very, very strong advocacy group that's holding the feet of the realtors and the city to the fire, and so they are able to move forward. And then, of course, something we all know very well, and that is when there are external nudges from higher levels of government or from Rockefeller, ICRIER, from other organizations who bring money to the table, which is extremely important, and who bring some insights and technical assistance and other kinds of things. Then people act. So I want to illustrate this and unpack this a little bit by telling you a little bit about the Surat story. So it's very well known that Surat moved from being one of the dirtiest cities in the country to one of the cleanest, and the turning point hinged on the 1994 floods. And so we can think of them as floods, that the floods did it, but that's not exactly the case, which we will see in a minute. But they went from being the dirtiest to one of the cleanest in a year or two, short period of time. very mediocre bureaucracy, and people like Shah and others there are people in the literature who've really called them names in the pre-1994 articles in EPW, and they suddenly now are, the poster childs of effective government. Not different people, but the same people can change, and then this has stayed. It hasn't faded away. For 25 years, more than 25 years, it has stayed. And so what was striking to us, what was interesting to us was, well, Surat has had we looked at the history of flooding. They flooded for 100 years. 1994 was not the first time that they flooded. 1994 was not the first time that the business elite, faced some kind of damage from water, nor was it the first time that people died as a result of disease. So vector-borne diseases are a monsoon phenomena that is endemic, that's gone on for a very long time. And people take it into their stride and nothing much happens, not much change used to happen. Then what was different about 94? And that was, some of the points that I made earlier, the nature of the disease. It wasn't just malaria that you could, cordon off and say, it's the poor, it's that neighborhood, and that's where it's happening. It's not going to come to us. We'll take care. No, this could leap to the entire community. It was this dreaded disease that, a modern city was not supposed to have, and could potentially threaten the poor and the rich and everybody. Just like in agriculture, you have small farmers. If they have pest problems, if they can leap over to the large farmers, they pay attention. The same thing happened here. And then this big dent in the reputation of the industrial elite, like the diamond firms. 90% of what they produce comes from outside and goes outside. And so why, people started to question, is this a place we can come to? That was problematic for them. And then migrant workers began to leave. It's a migrant worker-based economy, and that was a problem. People talked about riots that happened, and so forth. And then this public shaming of the bureaucracy. So you had people watching, nationally and internationally, and they called this into question because it could not be explained away as a natural disaster. Natural disaster doesn't lead to plague. It's when it falls on filth and dirt and other things that is the duty of a civic government to deal with, is when it becomes a problem, and that became totally visible. And so they acted, in our view, and it's not that these kinds of man-made, human-made pressures have followed them even until 2006. So this to us was interesting to unpeel and to understand. So then we wanted to see, did they do something different? So they acted. What did they do something? What did they do? And can we learn anything from the sequence of their action? And that was useful and interesting for us to see as well. So the problem was water, floods, and humidity. Floods had receded and all the things that had happened, but it was this whole water thing. So one can say preventing floods would have been a big issue. But the first place where they acted was solid waste management, sanitation, sewerage. And they acted on that not in everywhere in the city, not in where the elites sit, but where the poor lived. Normally they are not attended to in these kinds of problems, but this municipality was forced to deal with it because that was the font of the problem, that was the place where things arose. So that's where they went first. They cleared the garbage, they made the drains operational, they put quota stone on the pavements to prevent waterlogging. They did all kinds of things from that angle. The kinds of things that are usually very hard for municipalities to act on. Garbage sits, nothing happens, but this was where they started, not on water. So, and their focus was on the poor, which is also unusual. That then was coupled with organizational reforms, and which have been written about a lot. But what was interesting about these organizational reforms was that it brought together the people on the ground, street-level bureaucrats, who do the work and sort of work in anonymity, and nobody cares about what they do. They were linked to the middle-level bureaucracy and others who also were asked to go to the field, so that you had a chain where information and knowledge flowed upwards and downwards, and the street-level bureaucrats on whom the onus sits to clean up the city came to be seen as an integral part of the city's response to these kinds of problems. They, of course, then privatized and brought all kinds. I mean, there were lots of things that happened, but the bringing in and valuing the work of the street-level bureaucracy and getting people outside to move from their offices onto the streets to understand what was going on was very important and has stayed. That issue, that connection has stayed. Then after that, after they secured this, they redoubled their effort on containing floods, which had many components. But the first thing was, let's secure our water system. Water resource reforms happened. Quality was paid attention to because it was poor quality that can lead to disease. The public health water sanitation link, which we tried to get our municipalities to act on, was forced upon this municipality. Then they focused on distribution, then they focused on costs, and all along this public health piece was very important for them. Of course, there was no magic bullet. They didn't have all the answers, and they muddled through. It was a messy learning process. But that acting and the pressure to act quickly and get rid of that disease that had come up and act in the way that we just described built learning capacity. So by acting, by deliberating on that action, they built learning capacity. In a sense, they created their own high watermarks. And then the results happened. People saw the results. And what was interesting in our interviews, this came out in our, we had a focus group kind of workshop right in the beginning when we were starting, and people said, there was appreciation. People appreciated what was being done by the municipality, and that built incentives for the municipality to continue to do this nested kind of work, not siloed work. So the non-siloed work came out of seeing the results of working together. And that public appreciation then created trust, built trust. And it manifested in this municipality being able to raise property taxes, raise fees, and people gladly paid. So it basically had good financial consequences from having delivered. And those outcomes of good performance, so coming to it's now expected of you. Your community expects that, and you feel good about it, you're rewarded. That comes to the attention of other levels of government, national governments, ACERN and others. So you see this capacity and say, reach out perhaps with support and technical assistance, which brings in new resources and new knowledge. But it wasn't just top down. The municipality also was the first in 1997 already. It applied for the very first biogas initiative to try to use alternative energy before anything was happening. 1998, they computerized the collection of water. Not that people paid online, but when they collected, it was computerized at the window and payment. They did a lot of things. And so then this institutional attention from the top down, which sometimes we rue and say that, okay, it's all driven by these higher level governments or non-state actors like JNREM, and how do you continue that? What we found in Surat was that it built institutional clarity for these organizations. They set up things like the non-revenue water cell. They set up the climate change trust, the health they set up institutions. So there is a benefit there that stays. Even when the funding goes away, the institutions stay. And what we found in Surat was that they've gone and sought other partners for money later on after ACERN has, the funding has moved. And then what all of this did was that it built responsiveness from the bottom up. That is, people began to take them seriously and respond to, the kinds of programs that they had. So even recently, there was this huge success of their rooftop solar program that they initially tested it on government buildings, but the real success came when they went out and aggregated demand, and it was the communities that came up. So they took their message to the people, but it was these RWAs and others that came up and registered. And that relationship was earned through this long process, this long arc of working together. And without that bottom-up support, of course, any kind of benign top-down stuff doesn't work. So this is interesting and impressive. It helped us see this whole Surat story in a new way. But even so, even so we realized that their efforts, even the interlinked efforts, still focused on sort of the flood public health area, waters, some of the hard and soft infrastructure around these things, that's where it focused, and less so on things like, the slow onset things like air quality, for example. In Surat, it was, what we noticed was, it's mixed use, it's dense, it's all good things in its spatial structure, and yet the air quality was so bad. And then we realized, as we talked to the government officials, that, we had a bus service, but then we kind of put it on a back burner because the commutes are so small, and the firms send the vans to pick people up, and there isn't really much demand, so they didn't push it. And so that's an example also of the slow onset versus this other thing, that even this very competent organization took some time. It's taken quite a while for them to get active on these other more hidden, less visible problems. And now they've done a great job. They have a BRT, they have a bus system, they've won awards, they've done a great job, but it's taken them some time. So, this last point here that I wanted to make about what it showed us was that there are latitudes and there are linkages. So the water and sanitation, and that's earlier story that we said, showed to us that there are some sectors and some problems that have linkages that can be leveraged, and they can become non-siloed that way if we pay attention to them. And then there are these issues of latitudes. There are some kinds of things that have very little latitude, like disease. You have to act now. But other things like, poor air quality is something that has a wider latitude, or a broken road you can get around. So that's another thing for us to sort of be aware of as we design entry points. And maybe, I don't know how I'm doing on time because we want our panel to also talk. I can give another another key example, and then close, run through it. This example is that we've talked about government acting. What about the private sector? And often we say that the private sector is often ahead of the government. And so we wanted to see that, and we did see that yes, they are. And in this case, it was temperature that we found was a big driver for what firms were doing. So what we found, I know it's a busy slide, there's too much going on, but the bottom line was that rising temperatures, which is a slow onset kind of problem if you look at it, had reached such a point that firms were telling us that our workers in the hottest months fall over on their machines. They hurt themselves. They make mistakes, and that's a liability for the firm. And when this was happening for a few years, these small and medium textile firms, diamond firms, small as well as large, were beginning to act on it. They didn't go to the government and say act on it. They were already on their own acting on it. So we then used that, what we saw, that they had already begun to do something. So what they were doing was moving the shifts up, higher up in the day, and leaving a couple of hours in the afternoon, where, in fact, the first time I went to a medium-sized textile firm was at lunchtime, after lunchtime, and there were no workers on the shop floor, and that's when they said, but they're resting over there, because it was June or July, it was really hot, they're resting. And then the story came out of why, and then they stay a bit later. So they're shifting things around, they're giving them bonuses to work in the hottest months, but they're also trying to climate control, do something about their supply chain in sort of the in-factory supply chain. And this was interesting. What we found was that these firms that were acting in these multiple fronts were acting to secure those segments of their supply chain where the value added was the highest. So if you look at this particular supply chain here, this is for the diamond industry, and firms told us, they actually told us, they said, to this part, the planing and figuring out that, this rock that you have, what are you going to get out of it? How do you design the cutting of that is where we make or break our bottom line. If you make a mistake there, you can lose millions. So in firm after firm, including small firms, that was air-conditioned. That place was climate-controlled. It doesn't have the most people, but it was. And this other part, with the polishing and has the most number of people, but was not necessarily climate controlled. So what this told us was that, yes, the firms are way ahead, they're doing things on their own, but if left to the market and firms alone, then adaptation will be uneven. It'll be unequal. It'll be selective. And this earlier slide that I showed about the impact of temperature on the bottom line, we were able to get daily data from some of these firms and then worked with colleagues to also look at panel data that, we talk about construction and agriculture, which is exposed, but most firms are closed. I mean, closed in the sense they work in a room and so forth. So what's the impact of temperature on labor productivity? And since we had daily data in the textile sector, what we were able to assess was that on the hottest summer days, the reduction in worker productivity is 4 to 9%, which is massive, which is pretty significant. I don't know where I'm going. Okay, sorry, I moved forward. And what that adds up to, so if you take at the aggregate level between 1971 and 2009, what this meant was that we reduced manufacturing's output to India's GDP by 3% as a result of warming relative to a non-warming scenario. And firms get it. They get it, and that's why they're acting. So therefore, the conclusion from here is that we can't leave adaptation to firms alone. The government will have to come in order to work with those that are left out of firms' own adjustment. But as planners, we can do a lot to reduce ambient temperatures. The cool roofs, green cover, green building technologies. Lots can be done to mitigate heat island effects, but let's think about industrial structure that way. Plan it, not just have a SEZ somewhere and then let people do what they do, but that should be something that we focus our planning efforts on. But there is also an entrepreneurial opportunity that is available in looking at alternative low-energy ways of getting to climate control and other kinds of things. These small firms in Surat are going to China, because China has exported its green technologies and so forth. So they're working with them and trying to see whether they can replicate something locally, and that's extremely important. And of course, the final point with industry was that, they were securing some of these things, but we found that their chemicals were completely unsecured. So if you have a flood and your chemical waste goes into the city water, that's a huge risk, and there are no standards. Nobody's talking about it. So I should probably wrap up soon. I won't spend time on these other things because our team will talk about the public health co-benefits, the effect of urban form. We already mentioned that Surat has compact urban form, but the benefits will not be automatic. You have to do all kinds of other things to elicit that, i.e. public transit. Similarly, you can't limit your focus, a spatial focus of climate and economic security to the city alone. The region is a very, very important place to look at. And in our plans, we found Kochi had that. 2 municipalities, 13 gram panchayats who are working together. And so this brings me to my final point, which is that a city's economy is as climate secure as its weakest link in the chain. We saw this with the Surat example, that to really help the entire city, they had to help the poor first. They were forced to. And why do we want to back into, when our backs are to the wall, then we go to that? Why not be proactive, knowing that that'll always be a vulnerability? Migrant workers are a huge example of that. And they are everywhere. There are indirect impacts, and it affects firms, when workers can't get to the place. So that, at the end, this is about bringing equity back in, was something that we found was very important. And the biggest surprise for us was that two of our colleagues, Amrita and Indro, did a quantitative study, tried to use quantify based on data that we could gather some of these variables that had our qualitative work had thrown up. And what was surprising and heartening was that that quantitative work, where we were trying to look for indicators that impact both the city's economy and its climate security, which kinds of things do both? That's what we were trying to identify. And if you look at what they found, you can see here that the proportion of the population living in slums, wastewater treatment, that is, responsible reuse, availability of public transportation, literacy levels, employment shares, social sectors were important not just for the economy, but for climate security as well. And this was, much more than a per capita investment on resources and so forth. So it was very heartening to see this finding. And that leads us to this last question, conclusion, that how do we build or conceive of urbanization, which is economically dynamic and also climate secure, in a way that is permanent, where we don't just react and try to say resilience is about bouncing back and then doing the same thing. It's about bouncing back and transforming, doing things differently, everything, housing, water, solid waste, all services that go into creating cities for what, as what they are, doing this differently. And what this means is, can we progressively use fewer resources each time we try to adjust fewer resources to get from one place to the other, to live, to light, to do all kinds of things. And then, or the whole thing about then reuse and recycle and renew and innovate, muddle through, messy, yes, but inclusive and equitable, which can then make cities what they really are, places of human flourishing for everybody. So thank you for listening to that. And I know we haven't left time for questions because we have to get through a panel. So what I'll do is quickly invite the panel to now illustrate a little bit of what we have talked about here with overall findings. The first presenter is Indro. He was a former fellow here, and now he's an economist and senior analyst at Rio Tinto.